Praise be, Jesus and Mary. I'm David Rodriguez, Content Director of the Fatima Center, welcoming you again to our show, Fatima Today. And this time we have a very special episode because Murray Rundus, our Fatima Rome correspondent, he is out in Rome, still at the Vatican. He's been covering the conclave. I know many of you have been watching his videos. And then also we'll finish up this episode with him back in his office. So we're very glad to have Murray once again. And I'm just going to start off by asking him a series of questions regarding the most recent papal election. I think everyone knows that Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost was elected the Pope. He is an American born from Chicago, and he has taken the name Pope Leo XIV. So let's just dive into a few questions that I think some people might be interested in to get Murray's commentary on that and what he's learned on the ground. Murray, again, thanks for joining us. I guess I'd start off just by asking, it was a very quick election. I was surprised by it. I think he was just elected in 4 ballots. What does that indicate to you? What are people saying about that?
Hi, David. Yes, I think that the election wasn't a surprise in that we saw Prevost. But what was a surprise was the speediness of which the Cardinals decided on him. What I think it confirms is that, and this is something that we expected going into the conclave, there were 2 distinct factions, one more progressive, one more conservative. The progressive faction was, the front runner there was Cardinal Parolin. The more conservative faction was towards Cardinal Erdo, it seems, moving into it. And I think there was a clear compromise made ahead of time, regardless of Prevost's actual positions, whether they be more conservative, more progressive, or even more moderate. He was seen as a compromise between the 2 camps. And we saw this even with Prevost meeting with Cardinal Burke ahead of time, before the conclave. It seems that there was a decision made that he would be the compromise candidate going in. And it took 4 ballots. And so what we can assume is that the first ballot and the second ballot even was just the Cardinals really trying to get their bearings on how many votes each candidate had. The third ballot is probably the real deciding moment, whether it showed whether or not Erdo or Parolin had the votes necessary to get to the amount they needed. And then I think Prevost came in that last ballot, and it was simply decided he was going to be the guy everyone rallied around with those 2 frontrunners unable to take the victory.
Well, that's certainly very interesting. Good insight you have there. Thanks. I will just say on a very personal level, I was sort of shocked when I first got the word from my wife that there was white smoke. She was actually questioning it. And I was like, no, I haven't heard anything. It's way too soon. There's got to be a mistake. And then I think she called me back like 5 or 7 minutes later. She's like, no, David, there is white smoke. We've got to get together, come back from the office. I need, the family wants to be together when we get these news and things. And I was a little shocked, but I was definitely worried because I thought to myself, if it was this quick, then that means I knew the bulk of the Cardinals going in were liberal, on that liberal side, or progressive, were more in favor of a lot of, let's say, Francis's synodal things. And I thought to myself, if it's quick, then that means because the hardcore liberals that were still strong enough would not have given in that easily. And I think the conservatives were a smaller group. So I went in and kind of dreading it. So we'll talk more in a minute, I guess, here once you're back at the office about the moderate compromise, because that intrigued me. But my second question to you out there is, he's also young, in my opinion. I think he's only 69, if I'm not mistaken. And that for popes is, I think, young, and it indicates certain things of what the College of Cardinals might also be thinking. So what does his young age for a pope indicate to you? And, what are the people saying about that?
Yeah, his age is an interesting thing because some cardinals, like Cardinal Pizzaballa, I think much of the college was scared to elect him because of his young age. And Prevost is still very young. He's under 70 years old. And what I think that shows is that the Cardinals are just very confident in him. We saw a lot of talk beforehand from many of these Cardinals saying they wanted a more quiet papacy, that they wanted a papacy that's going to be more reserved. And I think they are under the impression, at least, that Cardinal Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV, will be able to lead the church in a direction that isn't going to be strong arming it or ruling with an iron fist. I think they think Prevost is going to be somebody who will moderate Francis's message, but won't push any boundaries too much to not make big waves, not make a big splash.
Interesting. I certainly don't share the Cardinals' confidence in that. But again, we can get to that in a minute. Third question I wanted to ask you. Well, I guess I could just phrase it: what's in a name? Obviously, it's very significant. The name that a man picks when he is named Pope. He has chosen not another Pius, not another John Paul, and not Francis II or another Benedict, which of course people have been saying. He goes all the way back to the last pope of the 19th century, a great, great pope, Leo. And there's a great pedigree there with Pope Leo the Great, St. Leo II. Those are two of my favorite saints. So he picks Leo the 14th. What do you read and what are other people saying about that name?
Yes, Pope Leo XIV actually explained in his address to the cardinals, his first address to the cardinals, why he chose that name. And there's many different reasons, and he even acknowledges this. There's Marian reasons, there's that I'm sure he's thinking about. But the reason he chose is he said that Pope Leo XIII was known for using the great social doctrine of the church to really deal with the first industrial revolution and the problems that it caused, the materialism that came out of that. And Leo XIV now sees that there is a problem in that there's a new industrial revolution, one that uses robotics and AI and automation, and that's threatening workers' rights, and that's threatening really just the humanness of people living in the modern world with this new, he doesn't use this word, but it's heavily implied, this transhumanism that has come about through these new technologies.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for all that information. Last question before we get into the office, and that's just if you made anything of, I certainly read his first sermon and his speech from the loggia. And I would say that there were a number of phrases that jumped out at me. Don't know if they jumped out at you, but any other phrases. But for me, it was like talking about accompaniment, talking about building bridges, talking about dialogue, talking about open arms to everyone, walking together. He talked to the people in Peru who have accompanied him, always open to receive. And to me, it sounded very much like the language that I've gotten used to with Francis, and not so much the language that I'm accustomed to reading in the great encyclicals of Pope Leo the 13th. He's not been declared a saint, though I think he should be a doctor of the church even, but that's my private opinion, so it means nothing. But anyway, it sounded to me very much like I was hearing Francis again with all the lines he was dropping. Anything he said that stood out to you, or even maybe just comment on those that I mentioned?
Well, David, you're right in that when we hear him talk, when we've been hearing these different addresses, many of the words that come out of them, it's very Francis-esque. There's a lot of Francis-isms in there. There's the synodality. There's the mention of carrying forth the message of Francis in the Second Vatican Council. One aspect, though, that I think he's trying to do, and I think is the result of this compromise that was made between these two factions, is that I think the goal is for the Leo papacy to come into this and moderate the Francis message. And so to propose that there's a hermeneutic of continuity between Pope Francis and even Pope Benedict. So there's not only a continuity between the Second Vatican Council and the preconciliar period, but now there's cleanup duty that has to be done for Pope Francis, because there's a clear rupture even between Pope Francis and Pope Benedict. So what I think he's really going to be trying to do, and what I think many of the cardinals are under the impression of what they're getting out of this, is that Pope Leo XIV is going to propose the Francis message with Francis words, but moderate it so it has a more orthodox, more conservative meaning, if that makes any sense.
No, no, Murray, it makes absolutely no sense to me. Maybe some of our listeners will understand it better. But if those terms are confusing to you, don't worry. It is to most people. Hermeneutic is a fancy philosophical word that it could be, say, the interpretation of something. So anytime you are interpreting a document, you have a particular hermeneutic, right? Yeah, I tell people, I could have this hermeneutic of my Catholic faith. And so I'm interpreting all things from that side. And so there was a clear rupture and a discontinuity in the church's doctrine and her liturgy that we have seen in the last 50, 70 years. It has caused people a lot of confusion. And so a way to, I think, try to get over that is to tell people, well, we're going to do a hermeneutic of continuity. But if it's discontinuous, then no matter how much verbal gymnastics you do, you just play the modernist game where you're, moving things around the shell and you're just using words that are devoid of meaning, and therefore it leaves one very confused. So, well, no, those are great insights, though. Thanks, Murray. I'll wait to catch up with you back in the office, and then we'll continue. Okay. So I really want to get your insights into some of the things we already talked about, as well as turning our mind to some Fatima connections that we might be able to see here with Leo the 14th. Um, so I guess the first question I had for you was, you mentioned earlier that he was seen by the College of Cardinals as a compromise and as a
Yeah.
moderate. I think those are both interesting terms because they, I think, the way our society is, they like those kinds of concepts. They like this sort of middle of
Yeah.
the road compromise. But I wonder about that. And I wonder what even moderate means. If you had something that was burning you in 10 seconds and something that burned you in 5 seconds, moderate between that would be burning you in 7 seconds, which is still terrible, right? It wouldn't be a moderate fire at all. So, what's your take on what the moderate here means, or in him, and what the Cardinals might see, or what you might see? I've got my own take on it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a lot to say on it. I think that when we use the word moderate, just as when we were going into the conclave, we had all of this talk about moderates, conservatives, progressives, liberals, and I even accepted that terminology. And the reason why I did was it is relatively speaking to the conclave itself and to the College of Cardinals. So it would be ridiculous, for example, to use terms like, oh, the people who are called conservative now, they're just they're progressives, and the people we call liberal now are super progressives, if we're judging them by like 1950s standards. And so when we are saying moderate, conservative, liberal, it's just relative to the conclave, looking who is the most conservative, who is the most liberal of this group we have. But there's, I think, a key in order to stay sane with this, because if we accept that terminology in reality and we say that this is the bounds that are acceptable. So, for example, we have to look at the College of Cardinals and find the most conservative person to find what is acceptable for us to be conservative in. We're going to end up in trouble because, as you've mentioned earlier, there is a clear rupture in papal teaching and magisterial teaching we can go back to the Second Vatican Council. It's certainly a rupture there, and then in the post-conciliar documents as well. And the way we stay sane, I'll bring this back to Fatima, David. I think the Fatima message gives the lay people a lot of autonomy and a lot of power over their own spiritual lives and sanity. And what I mean by that is that even though there are certain things that are out of our control in many ways, the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the combating of the errors of Russia on the state and church level. That might not be something that we can actively be involved in, but what is Our Lady constantly telling us to do? It's these individual things, praying the rosary, doing the 5 First Saturday devotions. That's extremely important, but also learning our faith in how to combat the errors of Russia, figuring out what those errors are, and combating them by knowing the true faith. And we were blessed that up until the Second Vatican Council, starting with Gregory the 16th, Pius the 9th, Leo the 13th, going up with all of the Piuses at the beginning of the 20th century, this was one of the greatest teaching moments of the church. We have so many good papal encyclicals that we can go read from this time, great catechisms that were produced during this time. And so I think the Fatima message calls us to, in order to stay sane and not get wrapped up in this terminology that is currently being used, we have to have not a conservative, not a progressive outlook on things, but an orthodox Catholic outlook on things that we obtain from reading those old
Exactly.
documents, from reading those old papal teachings. So I know that's a long spiel there, but I think that's essential in order to not go crazy with some of these
Well, and I'm
this
glad
terminology.
here at the yeah, I'm really grateful that here at the end you brought up that word because that's where I was going to go with this. I don't like the terms liberal and conservative and progressive because I don't know what they mean and I don't know what anybody means by them. And then they're very elusive and transitory. So I think it's
Hmm.
very important when we use language to use correct and precise language. And I think that's one of the great tricks that the modernists use to gain the upper hand is just the way they manipulate language to suit their purpose. And so we can't feed into that game. So I definitely would be more comfortable and do it in my own conversations, promoting concepts like, well, is this individual pro the message of Fatima? And here, of
Yeah,
course, I guess I might even have to add a proviso like the full message of Fatima, the authentic message of Fatima, as opposed to the watered down, weak version. Or are they against the authentic message of Fatima? So I would definitely like to get into that in a few minutes here. And then the
yeah,
other one that I would use is orthodox versus heterodox. And here, no confusion, has nothing to do with the Greek Orthodox or schismatic. Rather, it means, are you faithful to the deposit of faith, or are you trying to change the deposit of faith? And so I don't mind. I'm not interested if you're a conservative, liberal, or progressive. If you're heterodox, I'm not going to like
sure.
that. And if you're orthodox, then it's not going to bother me too much if you're progressive, liberal, or conservative, because in fact, you're orthodox. And
Yeah.
so I really like that classification. And so on that note, the way I looked at things, I would say some of the most disastrous things that happened under Francis's pontificate are Laudato Si, where he acted like the environment was so huge, and the Pachamama idol worship, that whole kind of strain. Then he had the whole Amoris Laetitia strain, where he was destroying Catholic morality and saying it was okay for those basically in public mortal sin to receive Holy Communion. So it's attack on our reverence, attack on our belief in the real presence. Then there was Fiducia Supplicans, where he's talking about the blessing of illegitimate unions, whether they be people that are like living together, divorced, and trying to remarry, or sodomitical couples, homosexual couples. And then there was Traditionis Custodes, this whole suppression on the Latin Mass. Then there was Cor Orans, the entire suppression of traditional religious life. A few other things like hell is empty and the death penalty is wrong. But I would say some of those are some of these like landmark documents. And thus far from everything that I have read and seen regarding Leo the 14th, I don't project there's going to be any departure from that. I think he's going to keep rolling with that flow, which means we're going to continue in this heterodoxy. And modern or not, if he continues in this heterodoxy, doesn't stand up for the truth, which is the truth that Christ gives us, that is the only truth that saves, then it's we got to roll up our sleeves and do a lot of work, a lot of prayer and penance, and a lot of living that message of Fatima. Certainly.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to what Leo the 14th is going to be trying to do, and again, we're dealing with a lot of speculation, and we can sort of maybe get into the reasons why one might be optimistic versus being pessimistic. I'll go back to something I said earlier, though, is that I think there is a consensus here in Rome, even among the progressive, whatever we want to call them, candidates, the ones who are more progressive than the majority of them, we can say. Even among them, there's a notion that what Francis did departed too much to the point where it's made the church very unstable. And so, what I think Leo the 14th will try to do is, for example, with Laudato Si, rather than coming into this like pseudo Mother Earth worship that oftentimes we saw under Francis it tended to, I think he'll try to give a message much more moderated of saying we want to make sure that we're preserving making it so that the environment is clean in a more moderate sense. So not dealing with the systemic crisis of global warming necessarily, but just making sure we're having clear air, clean air, clean water, and also having again looking at the modern technologies, seeing how the corporations are exploiting the planet, but also the workers, and combating that. That's going to be a lot more suitable to Catholic teaching than what we saw under Francis. And I think we'll also see maybe some rollbacks of even something like Traditionis Custodes interpreted in a different light to give the bishops more power, to allow the Latin Mass, which is not perfect. Again, we want to see a return to the complete liberation of the traditional Latin Mass. Even liberation is a ridiculous term to use. The priests have the right to say the Latin Mass. And then finally, something like Fiducia Supplicans, I can see.
Said, yeah, I wanted to go exactly there. So give me your take on fiducia, and then I'll give you mine.
I think when it comes to Fiducia Supplicans, Pope Leo will probably come out and interpret this as saying what we saw, at least like what the Pope splainers were saying during Pope Francis, and saying you can bless the homosexual couples, but it has to be for their repentance, for example. And maybe the priest has to say two blessings rather than one, which would signify blessing the couple. And there's a way where you could, read the document blindfolded, and you could come out with that conclusion. These interpretations of Francis, it's going to be very strange in some areas. It's going to be very strained as well. They're going to have a really difficult time doing it. But I think that's what they're going to attempt to do. They being the pontificate. I think that's what Pope Leo is going to try to do: clean up the mess and the open ends that Francis left.
Yeah, I'm not nearly that optimistic. I think that Fiducia Supplicans gives us a good template for what we're going to see because of the way he's already responded to it. And much of what you said fits into that pattern, I think, with regard to the Cardinals. Um, he basically came out and said, look, you can't sort of do this too forcefully. The bishops have to have their own autonomy. The bishops' conferences have their own autonomy. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, leave this to bishops' conferences or individual bishops. And I do think that makes him appear as a moderate, as a compromise. I do think that's the kind of message that a lot of the cardinals would like, and even a lot of the bishops, because it's sort of like, okay, the Pope's not going to be like hammering things tyrannically over my head, and I get to do what I'd like. And so I think that's where, and then the media can really spin that as how gracious he is and how hands off he is. But in this, I see that it's actually just far more shrewd and far more cunning than Francis. And it's actually the right play from the diabolical disorientation side, because there's always a kickback, when you're too crazy. But if Francis has already stacked the deck with many of the bishops and many of the cardinals in the world, and I believe he has, because you see how quickly Prevost was elected, then they pretty much already know where this is going. They already know that the ball is rolling down very quickly down the hill and the avalanche is picking speed. So you just don't stop it. You can just stand by and say, well, I'm not really going to do much with it. And the bishops can do what they want, and the cardinals can do what they want, and you know full well what they're going to do. But you don't clearly call out the error and say, no, this is contrary to the Catholic faith. And of course, that's what we need at this point. But I don't think Prevost will do that at all. I don't think he'll come out and clearly say that it's erroneous, and will really stand up for the true teaching of Jesus Christ our Lord and say that it's absolutely impossible for us to ever bless these kinds of unions, and you can't even give the impression of that. And the problem with that is because that's precisely the role of the Pope. The role of the Pope is to clarify doctrine when there's confusion and to uphold the true deposit of faith. And that's his job. So to just sort of quietly sit by and allow that compromise, well, there's 9 ways of participating in somebody else's sin that you don't
Mm-hmm.
commit yourself. And if you have the authority and the power to correct them, and you don't, you have the responsibility, then the church has always taught you're just as guilty of that sin. But this is not a message that the world today understands or recognizes. So that's where I think he's going to be, yes, more cunning and more shrewd and far more subtle and far less public, but the damage will go on unabated or even intensify, because the other thing is everybody knows what's going on behind closed doors. And everybody knows who are the men that are climbing the ecclesiastical ladder and are getting, the tap on the shoulder and are getting the promotions. And you're going to see by a lot of that in a more subtle way who's advancing the cause that, those in power really, really advocate. And it can be subtle, but it will still lead to great destruction. And I think that's the real danger here and what's going to happen. I think Fiducia sets it up. Same thing with Traditionis. It could be that way. He doesn't come at it as hard. But again, it's going to be known that you don't really want to favor this. And if you want to move up in the world, don't really favor it. Make it as hard as you can. And so I think the persecution for those who want to be Orthodox and want to be faithful to Christ and Our Lady's message is going to continue unabated.
Here's a wrench that can be put in that. Because I think what you're saying is, broadly speaking, I think it's very true that what's going to happen is, and I think this was the compromise that was made, it's going to be more power to the bishops' conferences. The Pope is going to have much less of a role that he's going to be playing. There's going to be fewer interventions. The problem that I see, though, that Pope Leo is going to inevitably run into is that the liberals have no problem pushing the boundaries. And I do think that Pope Leo has certain principles more so than Francis did. The reason why we had all these problems with Francis is that his personality was the ideology. It was him. It was whatever his whims were in the moment. Pope Leo, I think, judging by his past statements, judging by how he's even presented himself at the beginning of this pontificate, I think he does believe in basic tenets, whether that be that Christ really rose from the dead, was crucified, the Apostolic Creed in general. That's enough to cause a problem if the liberals push the boundaries, because eventually, if the liberals are completely undermining everything, the original principle of saying we're going to give more freedom for the Episcopal conferences so we don't have this Pope causing controversy. If we then have bishops' conferences are the source of controversy, like what we saw with the German bishops recently allowing complete blessing of same-sex couples, just not even any kind of doubt about it. I think that could make Pope Leo a conservative, because I do believe he has a belief in Jesus Christ, in Our Lady, and in her intercession, in her power. There's been some great signs in regards to that. His constant mention of her, his visit today to the shrine of Our Lady of Good Counsel, his devotion to her, in his constant, even in his first address, mention of the gospel, the risen Christ, the real reality of Jesus Christ, and also the power that was given to Peter. If he really holds those things, it will not be the conservatives just because of the way they act. It's not going to be the conservatives that push the boundaries. It will be the progressives. And he could become frustrated and be made into that orthodox person who has to stand up for the faith, that true Leo that we would want to see. That's my hope. That's me being optimistic, looking at some of the things that we've seen. I certainly don't think that's going to be the default of this papacy, but I think there's potential that wasn't with Francis that is in Leo, if that's making some sense.
Oh, well, that makes sense, but definitely you're far more optimistic than I. I think, well, we'll see. We'll certainly see. The other thing, though, that I would get to and this is obviously perhaps the most important question from my end, it obviously dovetails the Orthodox and heterodox question, but that would be, is he in favor of the authentic and true message of Fatima? Is he aware of it? Is he going to try to push it through? And of course, given everything I've seen already, I definitely have my very serious doubts. The biggest reason is because what we know, and I think what the whole world knows, even those who have not read the Third Secret, because now at this point, if he chose to, he could read it. I wonder if he will, or if we'll even find out if he will. I don't think we ever heard if Francis read the Third Secret or not. I don't know if he just stayed away from it and didn't want to read it. But anyway, we already know that the Third Secret talks about a mass apostasy in the church, grave negligence by the shepherds of the church, the pastors. These are coming from previous cardinals, previous popes, and even the Fatima archivist for 16 years, Father Joaquin Alonso. We know that from quotes even Eugenio Pacelli, Pius XII, that he was worried about Our Lady's warnings to Sister Lucia about the changing, ultimately the suicide for the church, her killing herself by altering the faith, altering the liturgy, altering all her past. And that's something that we've just seen happen en masse. I mean, we've seen those things happen. So I'm convinced this is, in fact, why the third secret has not been revealed in toto. We also know, for example, and we talked about this with Dr. Micah Hickson recently on one of these Fatima Today shows, a quote from Father Ino Derlinga, who knew Benedict XVI when he was cardinal, and they had talked about the third secret, and Cardinal Ratzinger had said it dealt with things like an evil council. A council did not accomplish what it was supposed to do and changes to the Mass. So I say, okay, then the people who favor all of those things, the changing of the doctrine, the changing of the Mass, the grave sin within the church, right? Because that's the other thing. I mean, huge on this, I think, that's coming, and Father Rodriguez mentioned this on our show, is the Vatican leak document that many suspect led Benedict to resign. A huge dossier by 3 cardinals that were basically uncovering much of the homosexual scandal within the Vatican Curia, within the hierarchy of the church. And once Francis became Pope, it's like nothing was done on it. So it's really still hanging there to see if now Leo XIV would deal with it. But again, I think all that's tied in with the third secret. And you realize, I don't want to bring this out into the open, if in fact you favor, for example, all the changes. And given that he's spoken so much, I would say the one thing that he's been rather clear about thus far is this is a synodal church that he wants to rule over. And the whole synodal process that Francis began is one he intends to continue. And I would say synodal is just a code word, not very thinly veiled at all, for continuous change, constant updating, which is the modernist mantra. So if you continue a synodal process, there's going to be continual change, and we're not going to get back to the basics and the foundational message. So I don't see him being very interested in looking at the third secret, or for that matter, ending this grave crisis that we see from a faithful perspective, which will only come about through the consecration of Russia. And therefore, obviously continue to pray for it. God can always intervene. Any supernatural intervention, like with Saul on his way to Damascus, could affect in a positive way the Holy Father or anyone else. So it's certainly in God's power. But barring that kind of real supernatural intervention, I'm not sure he's going to be interested right now, from everything I've seen, in getting Russia properly consecrated, releasing the third secret, and really promoting devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the daily rosary, the brown scapular, those sorts of things.
A few things on that. I think that you're right that he definitely has said this, and it was in his address to the cardinals today. He has made sure to reiterate this, that we thank Pope Francis for what he has done. We're moving forward with the synodal way. We're moving forward with collegiality that was set forth with the Second Vatican Council. However, and this gets really frustrating because this is just typical for our modern age, where words can have two meanings, or more than one meaning. The crisis of ambiguity, of analogous language, is that this is something I saw Cardinal Erdo, who is the supposed conservative front-runner, leaving into things. He started doing this with the message of collegiality, where he meant by collegiality simply taking power away from a centralized papacy with a few lay people that the Pope has chosen, and giving it back to the bishops in their local diocese. Now, I think what's probably being done is there's a political move where the liberals can be content to say, look, we have this synodal church, and so Francis's legacy doesn't get tarnished, but the conservatives can gradually use the synodal way to give power back to the local diocese. That's one thing. Now, the other thing is, I think this is very important for people to get when it comes to the false Fatima message that is often proposed. And this was something disappointing. Cardinal Parolin, the liberal candidate, and then the more conservative Erdo, they both had the same error in their mind, which was thinking that the consecration of Russia was done by John Paul II when he consecrated the world, which is just evidently not true. The second is that the third secret despite the Vatican keeping it so, literally secret, they weren't going to tell anybody. They're hiding it. That they made that entire thing about John Paul II's the attempted assassination on him. That's what's often proposed today, and that basically Fatima was the message of Fatima was completed by the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed. And that was our version of world peace. That is the pseudo Fatima message. That's not, and the errors of Russia have to do with the Soviet Union, which John Paul II courageously destroyed. That has nothing to do with the actual message. The actual message gets deeper. It's talking about materialism spreading throughout the world, not just within the USSR. The errors of Russia more generally in that materialism spreading throughout the world. And then further, that I think it's nearly certain. I'm nearly certain about this myself, as you mentioned, that we did not get the full third secret. The current document we have it's confusing on the way it's laid out. It's confusing that they only released this part once they needed it for the propaganda for John Paul II's papacy. And
Right.
then, as you mentioned, the comment with Ratzinger, I think there has been signs that there's more to that. Now, when it comes to Pope Leo XIV. Will he be a devotee of the true Fatima message? Not at first, but let me give some might call it delusional, but let me give a path forward where I think people need not despair, because I think there is a path forward. And I base it on two things. One, when it comes to what the Pope needs to do in order to actually carry this out properly, a prerequisite is that he knows what the papal office is and what the prerogatives are with that. That's something you can argue Pope Francis had no clue about. He thought, it's a one bishop among many. In many of his statements, it seems like this. What Pope Leo has done, again, these are external things. We're going to know more as things progress. He's come out with the Mazzetta, which is that red garment that is a symbol of the papal office and of the papal authority that the Pope uniquely holds. He's made sure he used Pius IX's ferula, which is the crozier, the big staff. That he could have used Francis's. He decided to go back to Pius IX. And he's even been, in some ways, again, I think the Novus Ordo Mass has serious problems with it, but he's tried, at least in some of these papal liturgies that he's done already, he's done the most conservative, and I dare use the word conservative there, versions of it, using things like the Eucharistic Prayer 1, making sure that the music is traditional, no girl altar boys. That was interesting. But finally, and the thing I think is most interesting, is the sort of nomen omen and connected with the prophecies of this, the situation surrounding the Pope, the names surrounding the Pope. Firstly, it's that Pope Leo, of course, is connected with those prayers at the foot of the altar after Mass and St. Michael the Archangel. And prayers to St. Michael the Archangel, because it is said that Pope Leo had a vision of the potential attack on the church. I think it's interesting that the day that Pope Leo XIV was elected Pope, it was the Feast of Our Lady of Pompeii, which is commemorating a big victory of the Catholic Church by the Rosary and St. Michael the Archangel's intercession. And what did Pope Leo do when he came out to greet everybody? After proclaiming the risen Christ, he asserted that that's a devotion everyone needs to attend to and pay attention to, and that's an obscure devotion. He knew about it beforehand. Our Lady of Pompeii and this connection with Michael the Archangel. And as I mentioned earlier, he's very devoted to Our Lady of Good Counsel, as he used to be an Augustinian. He is an Augustinian, used to be the head of the Augustinians, and is greatly devoted to this one shrine, this icon of Our Lady of Good Counsel as well. So I think all of that leads me to say, maybe we do see some liberal progressive resistance against Pope Leo and his Marian devotion, his trusting in Our Lady, and his knowledge of these traditional Marian apparitions will lead him to understand the message of Fatima more completely and understand that he does have the power to fix these problems in the world, and that the liberals are opposing him because of his true papal office that he needs to use to fix these problems. Again, is that a guarantee that that will happen? Absolutely not. But I hope people can see there's certainly paths forward, and God can do very mysterious things. And I
Yeah, I
don't
mean,
doubt that that's something he could do.
there's pass forwards, but there's going to have to be a pretty serious, I would say almost like U-turn.
Yeah.
Interesting also, by the way, that you mentioned May 8th is the Feast of St. Michael of Monte Gargano. It is a wonderful feast, and I haven't heard too many people talking about that one. And you just brought up the whole St. Michael connection. So, that just jarred that in my mind. That's a very
Yeah.
important feast. And, St. Michael did appear at Fatima. There's strong connections here. St. Michael is a great defender of the church. We see him if there's visions. I think it was, now I can't remember which saint it was in the 1900s, but Saint Michael was either sheathing his sword or taking out his sword, depending on what was happening to the church. Um, I think it's interesting that at least I perceived you speaking of it as a good thing, and I'm not sure it is. This idea that he's going to quote unquote give more power back to the local dioceses, and that might be a way that the synodal process it means. Um, because again, if in fact you've already had decades of modernism and many, many bishops installed by um, Francis, then giving power back to the local dioceses doesn't solve the problem at all. It can very easily allow it to escalate and speed up. And that just depends on the kind of bishop you have. So giving power to the local bishops is not necessarily something that I think is a good thing. It could be very much a negative thing given the state of affairs that exists in the church today. Um, Moreover, I would say it is interesting because a key element that many people misunderstand about the message of Fatima is that the Pope does have to, as Sister Lucia said and our Lord said, he has to command the bishops to do
Yeah.
this consecration with him. And so there's been a big bucking against the authority of the Pope and sort of saying, no, you can't command us. You do have to leave us alone. And obviously, God always gives the right medicine for the problem we have. And so I've always read in this understanding that the Pope's going to have to command the bishops that precisely one of the problem is that the bishops don't want to obey the Pope and they want to go run off and do their own thing. And the Pope has to remind them, no, this is not how things work. You do have to obey, and I can't issue this command, and everyone in the world has to obey this. But it kind of runs contrary to that mentality of, oh, it's a good thing to give more power to the bishops. And if you have the mindset of it's a good thing to give more power to the bishops, you're not very likely, this is what I meant by you're going to have to do a U-turn, you're not very
Yeah.
likely going to have the mindset of, well, I'm going to also have to command them to do this right thing. And I think that is part of the necessary answer, because that synodal way leads us very much down to the model that has been promoted more by the schismatic Eastern Orthodox, where the bishops kind of can do their own thing and they just respect the Bishop of Rome, but he has no authority over them. And that's the other thing that underlies the problem. This East-West schism is going to be healed by Our Lady of Fatima. You cannot have peace in the world
Yeah.
if the church doesn't have these problems. And one of the gravest errors of the Orthodox schismatics is that the Pope doesn't have authority over them. So it's not necessarily a positive thing to say I'm giving more authority back to the bishops. Given the situation we're in today, I think it's worse, and I think it makes it more difficult for the Pope to actually understand what Our Lady and God are calling him to do in this moment, vis-a-vis the importance of the Fatima message.
I don't mean that it's a good thing that, well, for example, the ideas of collegiality that were promoted by the Second Vatican Council and then synodality that sprang from that. The problem with it is looking at these very precise things is, for example, where does the authority to rule jurisdiction, where does that come from? Does a bishop have it on his own, or does it come from the Pope? Tradition says it comes from the Pope. All of these things are being confused in the post-conciliar time after the Second Vatican Council. It's something that, as you mentioned, is an attempt. It's connected with ecumenism, trying to bring us back to the Eastern Orthodox, so that the Eastern Orthodox have a better time accepting the Pope. However, there's a practical thing, a real world understanding of what's going on, that the there's a paradox in the modern world, the modern Catholic Church, that even though Pope Francis seemingly disrespected and had very little esteem for the papal office, he used it in the most heavy-handed way that we've seen in the past centuries, using it to try to get rid of the traditional mass, going into local dioceses and shutting things down, removing Bishop Strickland,
Well,
all
I
of
mean,
this.
interesting that you mentioned that because that was one of my other real big concerns with this concept of giving authority to local dioceses because it is, in fact, Cardinal Robert Prevost, who was in charge of the Congregation of the Bishops when they removed Strickland. So he was intimately involved in that process and supported it, as well as the really the really sort of most favorable towards tradition, conservative, reverence in the liturgy, faith, fidelity, doctrine in France. Dominique, his name is escaping me right now, but he was the Bishop of Toulon. They removed him also. So a lot of questions. To see the way I see it is you actually do need a strong pope today because the
Mm.
crisis has gotten so completely out of control and so much cleanup needs to be done. Modernism has spread its roots in so many places that you do need to have a strong pope, not that's heavy handed, who's acting with great charity, but is very strong and is not going to take any. It's very much what I think our Lord was. I think our Lord was ultimately, you can't be more charitable than our Lord, but he was strong. I mean, you read the Gospels, he never stops challenging you, he never stops correcting you. He is very, very strong, and he's very clear on what it means to follow him. I think we need a pope who's going to be very, very strong and really clean things up to get out of this mess. And I think that'll be the pope who's much more likely to consecrate Russia, recognizing this is part of the cleanup. And I've got to, drag everyone along with me, whether they want to come or not. I have the authority, I have the obligation. They need to come, because I think that's part of the remedy that is needed right now, and that's what worries me. I don't see that at all here.
I think one of the issues, and this is something that's talked about a lot in traditional Orthodox Catholic circles, because again, you talk about a nature of a paradox. We would want to see, of course, a a strong in authority traditionalist pope, and this was the assumption before the Second Vatican Council, that we should really try to concentrate as much power into the papal office as possible, because of course he'll always be promoting the true faith. But of course the problem is, if you do that, you also give the chance for somebody like Francis to come in and attack the faith itself. And so this is just something that has to be dealt with. It's
There's a
a
tension.
more, yeah, there is a tension there, and a
There's
way
a
that
real tension. I agree with you. I know what you're saying. I'm just gonna. I mean, my only, like, my last word on it, what I would fall back on is I would simply say, right. There's a tension. It's tough. There's always this. You have dangers and pitfalls in both directions. But what I know with certitude is that Our Lady at Fatima never stopped asking us to pray for the Pope and really
right.
highlighted the role of the Pope above all other roles in a way that's unique. So I think because of that divine revelation that God gives us through Our Lady at Fatima, that we do need that kind of Pope. Even despite the perils you mentioned, I mean, I've heard those discussions and I've been engaged in them, and I agree that there's merit to both sides. But I think the tipping factor is Our Lady of Fatima placing that emphasis on the Pope, saying the Pope needs to do this, giving this real message to the Pope.
The issue is, though, I think the cardinals don't believe in Our Lady of Fatima when it comes to the true message. That's the issue. And
Definitely.
so they see this with a more utilitarian, even mindset of saying that, and by believing in Our Lady of Fatima, again, I mean the true message, they think it's been done. They think it's over with. Their mindset now, though, is to try the ones who are more conservative, who, for example, are saying like, "Well, I want to keep the traditional Latin mass in my diocese, but I want to also have the Novus Ordo. I kind of want things to be like how they were under John Paul II." Well, that type of cardinal, that type of bishop, wants the Pope to stop messing around in his diocese, if just because of what we saw under Francis. Now, again, to kind of tie it all together, because I do think that that's probably, again, we know so little about actually what Prevost was actually doing in the dicastery of bishops, because there's rumors that Pope Francis neglected to listen to any of his advice, that Prevost was trying to get in more conservative bishops. Francis turned him down. There's rumors that Parolin was more involved in getting rid of Strickland than Prevost. I mean, it's endless. But what I think it comes down to at the end of the day is that something is going to have to provoke Pope Leo XIV to make these decisive actions. And again, the reason why I still remain somewhat optimistic is because I think God really does care about somebody's interior dispositions and devotion. And he has demonstrated a devotion to the risen Christ and Our Lady at these apparitions. And I'm, again, tied in with that character of what we've seen with these Pope Leos, going back to even Pope Leo the First. That's why I think this is very mysterious, where he has this vision when Attila the Hun is coming to destroy Rome. He sees a vision that protects the church. And Attila the Hun sees it as well. So I tend to think, viewing things with a sense of totality, that based on this Marian devotion that he has, based on his belief in the risen Christ, it is at least a possibility that in this political game of trying to give power back to the bishops, the liberals could take the church so far in a different direction that he himself knows is not the case, because he believes in the papacy, he believes in the risen Christ, and he believes in Our Lady, that maybe something can happen where he could actually come to the fullness of the truth. That's what we hope for. Is that certain? I don't think so. Definitely not. But I think there's more hope today in a church under Leo than there was a few days, a month or two ago when it was under Francis. That's my take on it.
Well, certainly time will tell. Um, I definitely thought that Father Rodriguez put out 12 good requests, and sort of the underlying ideas there, these litmus tests that over the months and the years to come, we will learn much about Leo XIV and how he responds to some of these very 12 pressing issues. Um, no, thanks. Good discussion. As I say, time will tell. So let's continue to
Yeah.
pray for the Pope. Let's continue to do a lot of penance. Let's continue to live that message of Fatima. So please always know the message, live the message, and share it. That includes the first Saturday devotion. Try to do it every month. The brown scapular, right? Prayer and penance. Pray your rosary every day. Pray for the consecration. Consecrate yourself to Our Lady's Immaculate Heart. Pray for Russia's consecration. All of these things are very important. I imagine if Father Gruner were here, he'd be making every effort, certainly prayer and penance, to get the new Pope to consecrate Russia. That was something he would always do. So we got to keep that up. Thanks, Murray. Thanks for all the reporting you've done. Any other closing thoughts, comments before we wrap this up?
I'll just reemphasize again. If our Lord says, "Be not solicitous for tomorrow will be solicitous of itself," or the different translations are go about differently. But I think this is something that we need to really take to heart here. If we are anxious about what is going on in the church, it's usually a symbol that we need to take our own devotions more seriously. Our Lord wants us to grow in virtue and stay away from vice. Our Lady of Fatima gave us the solution to how we can do that, and that is studying the faith and going about those traditional devotions.
Thank you, Murray. Thank you all for watching and tuning in. We'll catch you next week on Fatima Today. Please do not forget to share this show, to like the show, and to subscribe to our channel. That's one easy way with just a click of a button that you can do a lot to promote Our Lady's message and spread the need for the consecration of Russia. I never forget, it is Our Lady of Fatima who gave us the only solution for our times. May God bless you.
Our Lady of Fatima, pray for us.